Right, and being able to define it for the physician to be...
Hi, my name is Dr. Ruth Haskins, and I practice OBGYN here in Folsom, California. Many of the folks sitting behind me know me because for the past 12 years I've worked with the licensed midwives to help define the scope of practice initially, and then serving as the vice chair on the Midwife Advisory Committee, from which I recently resigned. Just wearing too many hats wore me out. But having been a party in this room with this group of professionals, I have nothing but respect for the people behind me and what they do. However, I want to remind the group who came to know me that a couple of years ago I was full of optimism and came to this room and talked to this group and said collaboration has become the key buzzword within ACOG. And I see good things in our future, and I was so full of optimism that a move away from supervision toward collaboration was on the brink. I was very excited that we were about to have a chair for District 9, as well as a president of National ACOG married to a midwife. Change was a brewing, and it was going to be good. And I was wrong, and I'm very disappointed. I'm sickened. I'm really, actually, physically nauseated to have to be the bearer of this news that it didn't turn out the way I had hoped. Now, why am I saying that when we should be talking about supervision? Because the first thing that Carrie Scarabon said is, we got to work towards something that works. That's what she said. We want to replace supervision with something, and we want it to be something that works. If we think about it, if I think about it as an ACOG physician, and I think, okay, what's going to work? There are two issues, two roadblocks, two things that you got to consider. One of them is, will ACOG support me? Because if I'm working outside of what National ACOG does, and I'm a gynecologist, and this will be the same for the family practitioners, they've got their own board too. If their board doesn't define what they're doing and approve of it, then they're practicing outside the scope of practice and they can lose their license. So one thing you got to think about is your governing board and what did ACOG come out with, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing that somebody who considers collaborating, supervising, or in any other way interfacing with the licensed midwives of California, when a physician's thinking about doing something with them, even just giving advice by phone, they got to think about, does my liability carrier cover this? Now, if I'm supervising a podiatrist, if I'm supervising an optometrist, if I'm supervising any of the other paraprofessionals who at this very moment are working very hard to get rid of the supervisory requirements that they have, because they all want independent practice. There's a whole group of them wanting independent practice. If I'm a physician supervising them and things go awry, so somebody's bunion doesn't get fixed when they actually had some disorder that somebody else should have treated. No big deal. But with the licensed midwives, something goes awry. If you have a baby that doesn't survive, or worse, survives and needs $8 million worth of care the rest of his life, or if you have a dead mother, that makes the headlines, and their carriers just are going to go haywire. They won't cover it. They won't cover it. It gets bad press, and they won't cover it. Unless, like CMA just represented, unless the risk is very clearly defined, unless the educational requirements of the licensed midwife are clearly defined and the relationship is clearly defined, we're not going to get liability coverage. So then, not only would I lose my credentials as an ACOG provider, so I lose my practice, but I lose my home, I lose my car, I lose everything I own, my practice, because an $8 million cerebral palsy baby, where I gave advice to a licensed midwife, that settlement isn't going to be covered by my NorCal. It just isn't. So doctors have the world to lose as it stands. With supervision, we're not covered by ACOG and we're not covered by our liability carriers. With collaboration, we're still not covered. Not by either one. Not by either one. So collaboration isn't going to work. So if Carrie says, let's get something that works, collaboration as it's written here isn't going to be functional in the state of California because of the current situation with carriers and with ACOG, and I'm going to assume with other boards like ACOG for other positions. What might work? The only thing that I can come up with as a practicing doc is consultation. If there's a complete transfer of care, even if temporarily, that's clearly defined, so that when the patient develops a risk factor like we defined 8 years ago when we defined the scope of practice, when a patient falls out of the criteria of a low-risk patient and into the realm of the maybe I need to get a doctor involved, right? If she falls out, instead of collaborating, instead of asking advice by phone, instead of working with a physician, what can work in 2012 in California is, patient, I'm going to need to consult out. I'm going to need to send you to a physician. The physician takes the patient wholly, complete new history, physical labs, whatever they need to do. You are now my patient. If they leave, they leave. But it's not I'm going to share you, because then you're sharing the risk. And nobody's going to support us in that. But if there's a consultation where the physicians have the patient as a patient, well-defined relationship, and I guarantee you ACOG will say that the physician needs to say to the patient, I don't recommend that you have a home birth, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's got to be part of the record. I understand that, and that's the part where I get a little sick. But that's the reality today in 2012, is that ACOG took a look at this in October 2011. They pulled together about 1,000 people in a room, put them together for a weekend. They looked upside, downside, all kinds of midwives, all kinds of people that were investigating access to care and insurance coverage and all kinds of issues. And what they determined was that, this is just ACOG, not the liability covers, that they can only recommend collaboration with ACOG members if it's an American midwifery certified midwife, period, no others. And they specifically said, licensed midwives, you can't do that. And they spelled it out. So a consultation over to the physician is the only workable solution I could see that would replace this collaboration.
May I ask a question?
I think I'm pretty much done.
Okay. It would be helpful to have a better understanding if a physician consults with another physician, the patient ends up perhaps being a patient of both entities, with people. Would that still be the case if the midwife is consulting with the physician?
That's a really good question, and that's squishy. The answer is squishy, and purposely so. I'm sure that there are physicians who take a patient in consultation, and the patient says, oh, I see, this risk, this is serious, and I want you to be my doctor and follow me through this. And the patient is seen by the physician in his or her office repeatedly, and then just doesn't show up at time of birth. Wonder where she went. And it's, what can the doctor do? On the other hand, if a doc sees a patient in consultation, knowing that she's planning a home birth, if the carrier is aware of that, if it's written anywhere in the chart, and the physician doesn't, the patient doesn't show up for the next visit, or the next visit, the physician is obligated to say to the patient, you didn't show up as is the standard of care, these number of patient visits, I can't be your doctor anymore. Find another doctor within 30 days, blah, blah, blah. What's the word for it? I'm not abandonment, but I'm terminating the relationship with you because you're not following my recommendation of I need to see you weekly in third trimester. That's what would be recommended, is a termination of that relationship. Otherwise, you're taking on risk. You've fallen outside of the ACOG standard of care of see a patient at 28, 32, 36 weeks, 37, 38. And if the patient shows up for every one of those visits and then doesn't show up for delivery, what's the doc to do?
Okay, so what I hear you describing reminds me a little bit of don't ask, don't tell.
Yes.
Okay.
And that, if you're looking for a solution that works, I think that's the only workable solution is, I don't want to know that you're delivering at home. And if you follow the criteria so that you allow me to do what I'm necessary to do as an ACOG provider, then I'm willing to step in knowing that you're seeing somebody else in addition to me. Well, I don't want to bring that up. I was going to say it's like the guy who knows his wife's having an affair, but it's okay with him. You know, it reminds me of the girl with the dragon tattoo. That was just a great relationship. You know, I know you're friends with benefits. I'm just looking the other way. That's what it reminds me of, and it works. It just works so nice in that book.
That's very helpful.
Great analogy. Didn't want to go there. Sorry.
Would it be fair to characterize your commentary as take out the collaborative relationship and move towards a consultative basis?
That is the only solution I see that would work. Because as was mentioned before, the liability of providing consultation rather than a transfer of care. A consultation would still not be covered by the carriers. That's still, any physician who consults, collaborates, gives advice to blah, blah, blah is not covered.
So consultation would have to be defined in part as involving a transfer of care.
Correct. That's very clear. If you give a consultation to somebody, they can either take your advice or not take your advice. And if you give advice and you feel really strongly that you need to do this, or this mother and her baby are at risk, and the midwife says, okay, thank you for your advice, and then goes the other way, it's not very well defined as to what's the liability of that physician in terms of the bad outcome that could follow when advice is given in good faith, and then there's a bad outcome because that advice wasn't followed. And that's the problem with working with rather than separate on parallel tracks. So that's
a good explanation. Thank you.
I want to thank the council for letting me speak as well. I've never been at one of these either, and I'm quite impressed by the speakers that have been up here so far. I am not, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Fischbein. I am a practicing OBGYN. I am a fellow of the American College of OBGYN. I was board certified in 1989, and I did my residency at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. And I have been supporting and backing home birth midwives for 25 years. I have become so enamored with the way they care for patients, and I have learned that the midwifery model, which is completely different and alien to what I learned in medical school, is a much better way for taking care of low-risk patients. So by being here today, again, I'm not an expert in legal language. I'm not an expert in insurance carriers or all that other stuff. But what I am here today is to give you just a little insight into my experience. I'm going to try to limit myself to 3 minutes. The midwifery model of care does things that I don't know how to do. I wasn't trained to do them. Licensed midwives are experts in low-risk birth. I have no training in low-risk birth. I was trained in high-risk birth. I was trained that all births are a problem. I think that to relate this to what we're here today for is the consumers of California. If you look at outcomes, and basically because home birth has been in the news in the last several years, there's been a lot more studies and a lot more research looking into home birth, and the outcomes of home birth are much better for low-risk patients than the same type of patient in a hospital. So if this panel is here to protect the consumers of California, it would be very clear to me that, and it should be clear to everybody in the room, that we should do whatever we can to augment what licensed midwives do to provide such good care. To have liability issues control the day and to put safety aside, because if it's safer for babies to be born with licensed midwives in the low-risk model, and we're going to have to punt that aside because of fears of liability, then we are attacking the wrong problem. The problem is not, as the previous speaker said so carefully, the problem is not, we're here not to address the liability issue. That's a separate issue. And obviously everyone who practices in medicine, law, midwifery, all know that tort reform is something that has to come down the road, or there is going to be limited access. But I would encourage that those who are opposed to this language and those who are opposed would consider their real motivation, and that safety is just a canard, all right? Because it is safer for midwives to deliver babies at home, and we should do whatever we can to make that more plausible. The reason that I am different than most of the colleagues who are fellows of ACOG is because of my experience. I've worked with them. I think that most people who condemn them have never been to a home birth. They've never seen a home birth. They've never worked with a midwife, and I have. And so I am in a unique position to give my 2 cents worth, which I hope is worth a nickel. That what they do is worth trying to protect and make it available to the citizens of California. And by changing the language to where they don't necessarily have to feel like they're violating the law. For instance, I have an office in Ventura County, California. There isn't one physician in that county who will back a midwife. So midwives sort of the indignity of sneaking around behind people's backs.
So can I ask one question? Can we read your comments as supporting at least the concept of what's included in this regulation?
Yes, I'm a big supporter of getting rid of the idea that midwives need to be supervised. They're intelligent. They want the best for their patients, and they don't need a big daddy looking over their shoulder and feeling like they're less. As I said before, what they do better than what I do.